The holiday music had died, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the air had been physically sucked out of the dining room. Rick stood at the head of the table, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax statue, my phone pressed tight against his sweating ear. Through the speaker, a voice that every American recognizes, calm, distinct, and terrifyingly authoritative, cut through the tension like a razor. "Secure line breach detected," the president said, his tone devoid of any holiday cheer. "Identify yourself immediately, or federal agents will be dispatched to your coordinates." Rick's hand, usually so steady when he was carving the turkey or pointing a finger in my face, began to tremble violently, and then the phone slipped from his grip, clattering onto the fine china. In that frozen moment, Rick thought he was merely teaching a disrespectful stepdaughter a lesson about the chain of command. He didn't realize he had just interrupted a nuclear rapid-to-response conference and committed a federal felony before dessert. To understand how we ended up with the Secret Service swarming our driveway, you have to go back 2 months to when this nightmare started. To my mother and her friends, I was just Sarah Vance, a boring logistics coordinator, who worked remotely and spent way too much time staring at screens in her bedroom. They didn't know that my shipping schedules were actually troop deployments, and my inventory lists were satellite encryption keys for the Joint Chiefs. I liked it that way. In my line of work, anonymity is a shield, and silence is the better part of valor. But that silence became impossible to maintain when she introduced me to Rick, my mother's new boyfriend, a retired Army sergeant major who had made his past service his entire personality. Rick was the kind of man who needed to be the biggest dog in the yard, even if the yard was just a suburban patio with a gas grill. From the moment we met, he looked at me with a sneer that barely masked his deep-seated insecurity. He would constantly quiz me on basic discipline while I was brewing coffee, openly mocking my posture or my lack of real-world experience. "You civilians," he'd say, shaking his head as if I were a lost cause, "you think the world owes you a living. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in my army." I would just smile tight-lipped and nod, fighting the urge to tell him that in my army, a man with his clearance level wouldn't even be allowed to pour my coffee. The atmosphere shifted from annoying to hostile the day Rick officially moved into the house. He immediately instituted standing orders for the household, posting a list of rules on the fridge like we were new recruits in boot camp. The most contentious rule was absolute: no phones at the dinner table, under any circumstances, no exceptions for work, emergencies, or God himself. He called my classified workstation an encrypted terminal worth more than his car, my video game setup, and he would bang on my door if I didn't come out instantly. "When a man of the house enters a room, you stand, private," he barked at me once when I was deep in a briefing. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't joking. He truly believed he was the highest authority in my world. He had no idea how wrong he was. The holiday preparation felt less like a family gathering and more like a chaotic staging ground for Rick's ego, a performance where we were all unwilling extras. Rick marched through the kitchen wearing a tight t-shirt emblazoned with dysfunctional veteran. "Leave me alone," a slogan that seemed ironic considering he hadn't stopped shouting orders since he woke up. He treated the roasting of the turkey like a tactical operation, barking at my mother to secure the perimeter of the mashed potatoes and checking the oven temperature with the intensity of a bomb disposal technician. My mother, Carol, a woman who viewed conflict avoidance as a holy sacrament, just fluttered around him nervously, whispering for me to just humor him because he was proud of his service. I tried to stay out of the way, retreating to the corner of the dining room with my laptop, but Rick's radar for disrespect was always sweeping the room. He spotted me typing and let out a loud, theatrical groan that stopped conversation dead. "Look at Private Benjamin over there," he scoffed, gesturing at me with a carving fork, always with the face in the screen. "You know, in my army, we actually looked people in the eye. You wouldn't last 5 minutes in the real world, Sarah. You're too soft." I forced a smile, biting my tongue until I tasted copper, while my internal ledger tallied another mark. He saw a lazy civilian playing video games. He had no idea he was mocking a lieutenant general who was currently the only thing standing between the eastern seaboard and a total communications blackout. On my screen, disguised amidst a clutter of open browser tabs, was the live interface for the NMCC, the National Military Command Center. The game he thought I was playing was actually a real-time visualization of a Tier 1 kinetic threat. A rogue state actor had just attempted a logic bomb injection into our orbital satellite grid, threatening to blind our missile defense systems. The colorful lines I was tracking weren't high scores, they were intercept vectors for Cyber Command's Rapid Response Unit. My finger hovered over the trackpad, not to scroll through social media, but to authorize a counteroffensive protocol. That required a clearance level so high it didn't even have a name on standard government organizational charts. I watched the data streams cascade down the screen, the red alert indicators pulsing silently in the corner of the window. The irony was suffocating. Rick was loudly bragging about a latrine detail he supervised in 1998, demanding reverence for his past while I was silently commanding a digital legion that was actively preventing World War III. I had to authorize a DEFCON 3 alert readiness for my sector, and I did it with a subtle biometric scan of my fingerprint on the chassis of the laptop, all while Rick lectured me about the importance of paying your dues. The only person who seemed to notice the disconnect was my grandfather. My grandfather, Arthur, a silent man whose eyes held the quiet, heavy weight of a war he never bragged about, sat in the armchair observing the room. He didn't say much, he never did, but he missed nothing. He watched Rick posturing with the electric carving knife, making a show of his knife skills, and then his gaze drifted to me. He saw the way I sat, back straight, eyes scanning the exits and the room dynamics rather than just staring blankly. He noticed the secure, heavy-duty encryption phone sitting face down next to my elbow, a piece of tech that definitely didn't come from the local mall. Our eyes met across the room. Grandpa Arthur took a slow sip of his iced tea, his gaze dropping to my laptop screen for a fraction of a second, then back to my face. He gave me a nearly imperceptible nod, a silent communication between two people who know what the burden of command actually feels like. It was a moment of profound solidarity in a room full of noise. He knew I wasn't playing The Sims. He didn't know I was a 3-star general, but he knew I was a soldier. I looked back at Rick, who was now aggressively sawing into the turkey, spraying grease onto the tablecloth while recounting a story I'd heard a dozen times. "You see this?" Rick boomed, holding up a slice of meat. "This is precision. This is what discipline looks like." I glanced down at my screen. The logic bomb had been neutralized. The satellite grid was secure. The threat was contained, and nobody at that table would ever know how close they came to eating their stuffing in the dark. Precision, I whispered to myself, closing the laptop lid with a soft click. It was maddening to sit there and be treated like a child by a man whose clearance wouldn't even get him into the parking lot of my building. But that's the job. You hold the wall, you keep the monsters at bay, and you let the people inside. The house think they're safe because of the lock on the front door, not the soldier standing in the shadows. For years I had tried to speak their emotional language, to explain that my work mattered. But they only respected one thing: loud, visible power. So I decided right then, as Rick laughed at another joke at my expense, that I would finally speak to them in the only language they understood. My phone didn't ring. It pulsed against my leg with a specific, rhythmic vibration that I hadn't felt in over a year. It was a Critic 1 notification, the highest priority alert in the U.S. military arsenal reserved for immediate threats to national survival. I glanced down and saw the caller ID was blocked, just a single flashing red pixel on the black screen. It was a direct line call from the White House Situation Room, and in my world, that isn't a request. It's a summons. I felt the blood leave my face, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden cold clarity of command. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly to avoid making a scene, clutching the device like a lifeline. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice steady but tight, addressing the table at large. "I have to take this. It's work." I didn't wait for permission. I was already moving toward the sliding glass door that led to the patio. I could feel Rick's eyes burning a hole in my back. He was standing with his wine glass raised, midway through a toast about loyalty. And in his mind, my departure wasn't just rude, it was an act of open rebellion. "Sit down, Sarah," he barked, his voice booming over the mashed potatoes. "Family time is sacred. That logistics nonsense can wait until we're done eating." I ignored him. I had to. I stepped out into the crisp evening air and slid the glass door shut, sealing myself in the cold. I swiped the answer key, bringing the phone to my ear. "This is Vance," I said, my voice dropping an octave into the steel tone of a general officer. "Authentication Alpha Charlie Niner." "Go ahead, Mr. President." The voice on the other end was urgent, detailing intercept vectors and casualty projections. I was no longer Sarah the disappointment. I was a commander maneuvering assets to prevent a catastrophe. I was discussing intercept vectors and authorizing engagement rules that would save thousands of lives. But inside the house, Rick wasn't seeing a patriot. He was seeing a defiant child breaking his rules. Through the glass, I saw him slam his drink down, the liquid sloshing over the rim. He said something to my mother, pointed a thick finger at me, and started marching toward the door with a face twisted in rage. He was coming to enforce his no-phones policy physically, completely unaware of the cliff he was about to drive off. I was coordinating the movement of the Sixth Fleet. Rick was coordinating his walk across the living room to ruin his life. The sliding glass door didn't just open, it was wrenched back on its tracks, with a violence that shattered the delicate focus I had fought to maintain. Rick stepped onto the patio, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own manufactured rage, and, for a split second, I didn't see a stepfather. I saw an insurgent breaching a secure perimeter. I threw up a hand, a sharp, authoritative gesture that I used to command rooms full of field officers, not family dinners. "Stand down," I warned, my voice dropping to a register he had never heard before, cold and hard as steel. "I am on a secure line." But Rick didn't hear a warning. He only heard a challenge to his fragile authority. He laughed, a wet, ugly sound that grated against my nerves, and sneered down at me. "Secure line? You're still playing office, Sarah? I told you no phones." Before I could pivot away, he lunged. His heavy hand clamped over my wrist, and he wrenched the encrypted terminal from my grip with a force that nearly dislocated my thumb. The panic that flooded my system wasn't for myself, or even for the bruising on my arm. It was for him. He had no idea that by touching that device, he had just tripped a silent alarm in a bunker 3,000 miles away. I stood frozen, watching the slow-motion train wreck as he raised the phone to his ear, his face twisted into a mask of smug victory. He was ready to dress down some mid-level manager, ready to scream at a boss he thought he could bully into submission. "Listen here, buddy," Rick bellowed into the receiver, his voice echoing off the vinyl siding of the house. "We are eating dinner. You don't call my house, and you stop calling my daughter, or I'm going to come down there and—" He stopped. The silence that followed was instant and absolute, as if the entire world had held its breath. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end clearly, but I felt the vibration of it in the air between us. It wasn't a shout. It was the low, undeniable rumble of absolute power, the kind of voice that launches airstrikes and signs treaties. "This is the President of the United States," the voice said, loud enough that I could hear the tinny distortion leaking from the earpiece. "You have just intercepted a classified Tier 1 communication. Identify yourself immediately." Rick turned to stone. I watched the blood drain from his face in a literal wave, leaving him a sickly, pale gray. His eyes, usually so full of arrogant fire, went wide and vacant, staring at nothing. He knew that voice. Every soldier, retired or active, knows that cadence. He realized in a terrifying heartbeat that he wasn't yelling at a logistics manager, he was yelling at the commander-in-chief. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock, but no sound came out, just a terrified, wheezing gasp. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. A strange calm washed over me, the icy detachment of the officer taking over the daughter. I stood up straighter, my shoulders squaring, my chin lifting. The girl who used to shrink away from his shouting was gone. In her place stood Lieutenant General Vance. I extended my hand, palm up, my eyes locking onto his with a lethal intensity. "Give me the terminal," I said. It wasn't a request. "Now." Rick's hand shook violently as he surrendered the phone. dropping it into my palm like it was a live grenade. I brought it back to my ear, my gaze never leaving his terrified face. "Apologies, Mr. President," I said, my voice crisp and professional. "Breach contained. The hostile is neutralized." Rick flinched at the word hostile, his knees visibly buckling. But the time for talking was over. The night air was suddenly ripped apart by the wail of sirens, not the distant kind, but the deafening, immediate screech of federal law enforcement. Blue and red strobe lights flooded the backyard, casting Rick's terrified face in a chaotic, strobing nightmare. The line had been compromised, and the cavalry had arrived. The blue strobe lights of the federal vehicles didn't look festive. They looked like a surgical intervention cutting out a tumor. 4 agents from the Secret Service advance team had swarmed the patio, their movements precise and terrifyingly efficient, pinning Rick against the very sliding glass door he had violated moments earlier. The man who had spent the last 2 months lecturing me on discipline and chain of command was now dissolving into a puddle of incoherent terror against the glass. As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, a sound that cut through the night air sharper than any knife, he started to weep, his retired hero persona shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Sarah, tell them," he blubbered, snot running down his face as the agents patted him down. "Tell them we're family. Tell them I'm a veteran. You can't let them take me." I stood there, clutching my retrieved phone, and felt absolutely nothing. For years I had trained myself to feel guilty for his outbursts, to take responsibility for his anger just to keep the peace. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I didn't see a father figure or a misunderstood patriot. I saw a security risk that had finally been neutralized. I watched them remove the combat knife he had used to carve the turkey, bagging it as evidence, and I thought about every time he told me I was too soft for the real world. He looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes, expecting the stepdaughter, who always folded, the girl who always apologized for things she didn't do. But that girl wasn't there anymore. Then came the second wave of assault, my mother. She didn't run to comfort him, she ran to attack me. It was a reflex she had honed over a lifetime. Whenever the world broke, it must be Sarah's fault. She grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into the fabric of my blouse, her face contorted in a mix of panic and accusation. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her ruined dinner party. "Fix this, Sarah. Tell them to let him go. You could have just told him who you were. Why do you always have to be so difficult?" I looked at her hand on my arm, then up to her tear-filled eyes. I saw the calculation there. She wasn't worried about justice. She was worried about the embarrassment, about the neighbors watching, about the narrative she had built around her happy new life. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. "I told him to stand down," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. "I gave him a direct order, and he chose to disobey it. That is what happens in the real world, Mother. He didn't know," she sobbed, gesturing wildly at the agents who were now reading Rick his rights. "He was just trying to have a nice dinner." "I am a lieutenant general in the United States Army," I stated, the words tasting like iron and victory. "I command the Cyber Command Rapid Response Unit. I don't play office. I protect this country from threats, including men like him who think rules don't apply to them." She stepped back, stunned into silence, looking at me as if I were a stranger. And in a way, I was. I was no longer the invisible child she could shuffle into the corner to keep the peace. I was a force of nature she had failed to recognize for 30 years. I turned away from her, and my eyes found the only person in the room who wasn't panicking. Grandpa Arthur was still sitting in his armchair, his glass of iced tea resting on his knee, unaffected by the chaos swirling around him. He met my gaze, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to his brow. A crisp, perfect salute from an old soldier to a superior officer. It wasn't mocking. It was the highest form of respect he had to give. I straightened my spine and returned the salute, holding it for a beat longer than regulation. "Ma'am?" One of the agents approached me, lowering his voice. "The vehicle is secure. We need to debrief you at the site." "Proceed," I said, glancing one last time at Rick being shoved into the back of a sedan. Take Mr. Vance into custody. I have no further use for him. I didn't look back at the house. I grabbed my laptop bag, walked past the neighbors gawking from their lawns, and climbed into the back of the waiting black Suburban. As the heavy door thudded shut, sealing out the noise and the drama, I finally exhaled. 1 year later, the silence in my office at the Pentagon is a different kind of quiet. It's the quiet of competence. The view from my window overlooks the Potomac, a long way from that suffocating suburban dining room. My assistant knocked softly before entering, placing a single envelope on my mahogany desk. Personal mail, General. It bypassed the screening filters because of the return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my mother's script, looping, frantic, desperate. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. I could practically feel the guilt tripping radiating through the paper. The updates on Rick's legal fees, the suspended sentence, the probation that ruined his reputation, and the plea for money disguised as an apology. She would want to know why I hadn't called, why I hadn't come home for Christmas, why I was punishing them. She would be tallying her own ledger, listing all the meals she cooked, and the rides she gave me, trying to balance them against my freedom. I looked at the letter, and then I looked at the shredder in the corner of the room. There was a time when I would have opened it. I would have read every word, let the guilt seep into my bones, and probably written a check just to make the hurting stop. But I had closed that account. I stood up, walked over to the machine, and fed the unopened envelope into the teeth. The whirring sound of the paper being turned into confetti was the most satisfying sound I had heard all day. I didn't hate them. I just didn't need them. My validation was on the stars on my shoulder, the respect of my team, and the knowledge that when the red phone rang, I was the one who answered. Rick spent his whole life demanding respect for the rank he used to wear. He learned the hard way that true power doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs to answer the call. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your silence for weakness, hit that like button and tell your story in the comments. Dismissed?